The sport of hockey has a fascinating trend, and that is that throughout its history, certain games at certain moments have meant so much more than the sport itself. The meaning has been political, it has been cultural. And this week, we saw another one of those moments where the sport itself really transcended and meant so much more to an entire country. The most famous example of what I'm talking about, which you've probably heard of, was the Miracle on Ice back in 1980. And if you don't know, that was the men's final in the 1980 Winter Olympics at a match in New York. The United States went up against the USSR, against the Soviet Union, who were the four-time defending champions when it came to gold medal men's matches in ice hockey. And the United States defied all expectations and at home in New York beat the Soviet Union's team 4-3 in one of the most unbelievable upsets in the history of the sport. And the significance of that really can't be overstated, particularly at the time. It was 1980, the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union is perceived as this enormous threat, and something that it had dominated for 4 Olympic Games in a row was shattered by the United States. So that meant something. Another famous example would be 2010 at the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, where the Canadians were playing at home. They wanted to prove themselves, and they went up against the United States in the gold medal match. It was tied up 2-2. They go to overtime, and then this man here, Sidney Crosby, scores a goal, instant win, and delivers Canada their 8th gold medal in the sport, beating the previous record held by the Soviet Union and cementing their status as the most successful hockey nation of all time. So Sidney Crosby solidifying Canada's excellence and dominance at the sport at home in Canada, the United States breaking the Soviet Union's image of invincibility in the sport. There are some pretty culturally significant moments related to hockey, and we just had one this week as well. For those of you who may have missed it, the Four Nations NHL Faceoff just wrapped up, and it was a remarkable tournament to witness, to say the least. So if you followed the NBA at all, the National Basketball Association, you'll know that their all-star games, these mid-season events where a bunch of the best players come together and play, is pretty awful because nobody's trying and they don't take it seriously, and the NHL didn't want to have a similar problem. So they invented the Four Nations Face-Off in lieu of an all-star game, something that they could hold that would actually get the players passionate. One thing you have to understand about the NHL is that a lot of its players, a majority of them in fact, are not from the United States. 40% of the players in the NHL are Canadians, only about 28% are Americans, and the rest are primarily European, the 2 biggest countries represented being Sweden and Finland. So the format would be the best NHL players from the United States, Canada, Finland, and Sweden would all go head-to-head, and then the most successful 2 teams would face off in a final match. Now, first I want to say, viewership numbers through the roof. This was an incredible success and a really smart way to get the players to really care, because they're not just playing for some exhibition event. They are really representing their countries, and people tuned in. But I'm going to be honest, I think a big part of the reason people were tuning in was because of the current political tension between the United States and Canada. Look, you know what the tensions are about. Threats of tariffs, jokes which are being taken quite seriously by some Canadians of literal annexation by the United States. And this has really bled into the sports world even before this. There have been incidences where American teams playing in Canada, be it in Toronto for the NBA or any NHL game, have bared witness to Canadians booing the American national anthem as it is being played in Canada. And of course, the American national anthem was booed in the Four Nations Face-Off as well. During their round-robin match up in Canada, the American national anthem was booed, but the Americans did kind of stand up for themselves there, and they beat Canada 3-1 in that match. And of course, as is the case always with hockey, quite a lot of literal fist fighting on the ice between the American and Canadian teams. So tensions, well, they were quite high. But before we get into the final, something you need to understand is that Canadians very much believe that hockey is their game, and they are massive contributors to the sport in general. Like I said, 40% of the actual plays in the game are Canadians themselves. 7 of the teams in the NHL are based in Canada, and hockey is the most popular sport in Canada by far. So there is quite a defensiveness for the Canadians that it is their sport and not anybody else's. So with that much national pride on the line, considering the situation with Trump and the tensions going on, a lot of people were tuning into this final for some hope of like vindication of their political beliefs. Canadians, because they wanted a win to show the United States what they were capable of and that this was their game. And some Americans of a more conservative leaning wanting to see that, look, no matter what Canada puts forward, the United States will always be better. And that includes the leaders of both countries. Trump had a little tirade on Truth Social about how he had called all the American players, told them what he expected of them. He was rooting for them. He would have people over to watch it, including some governors. And he jokingly invited Trudeau to come watch with him because Trudeau would eventually be the governor of the 51st state, referring to Canada. So the final is being held in Boston, but a lot of Canadian fans have come down to support their national team in this tournament, and it is an absolute nail-biter of a match. Canada takes an early lead, but the United States, putting in a hell of a fight, manages to catch up to them, and we are tied at 2-2 heading into overtime, which interestingly enough is the exact same situation 15 years earlier during the Olympics in 2010 when Canada and the United States were going head-to-head. It was 2-2 and they were heading into overtime. NHL overtimes are not like overtimes in basketball or most other sports where you just play for an extended period of set time. In the NHL and in most versions of hockey, the team that scores first in overtime wins. It is sudden death. And this is where history again repeats itself, because the team that did score and won the match in overtime 3-2, just like they did in the 2010 Olympic final, was Canada. And look, they always say that history repeats. And I don't know if that's true, but it certainly does rhyme, because the captain of the Canadian team this time around, almost as their good luck charm, was a 37-year-old Sidney Crosby, the man who in 2010 hit that overtime goal to win the Olympics for the Canadians. This was a win that Canada needed in this moment, because when you have your neighbor to the south threatening you in so many ways, really trying to ruin day-to-day life for Canadians, it means something to show that country that you still own that sport, the sport that makes you who you are. I think the person that probably put it best, way better than I ever could, was Justin Trudeau himself, who after the game posted on Twitter, "You can't take our country, you can't take our game."